Sarah stepped off the ferry at Battery Park and looked up. The buildings around her stretched toward the sky like giant concrete and steel trees. She had seen pictures of New York City before, but nothing prepared her for the real thing. For more than 200 years, visitors to New York have asked the same questions. Manhattan, the most famous part, is only about 13 miles long and 2 miles wide. When people first came to live there, they had plenty of space. But as more and more people arrived, space became a problem. Other cities could simply grow outward, building new neighborhoods in the countryside. New York could not do this. It was surrounded by water. By 1900, New York had buildings that were 20 stories tall. By 1930, it had buildings that were more than 100 stories tall. These skyscrapers became symbols of American success and innovation. People from around the world came to see them. They took the ideas back to their own countries and built their own tall buildings. The city's skyline tells one of the most amazing stories in human history. It is about creativity and problem solving. Every building in the city had to solve unique problems. How do you get fresh air into a building that is surrounded by other buildings? The architects had to think about how people would use their buildings. It faced challenges as America faced challenges. The buildings reflect the hopes, dreams, and struggles of millions of people who came to New York looking for better lives. They had to consider how people would feel when they walked into a lobby or looked out a window. They'd take pictures of the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. They'd visit the observation decks and ride the elevators to the top floors. But the real story is bigger than any single building. The lessons learned in New York are being used to build better cities around the world. The innovations first tried in New York are helping to solve problems in cities everywhere. The spirit of creativity and experimentation that built New York's skyline continues to inspire architects and city planners today. It is the story of how human creativity and determination can overcome any obstacle. They had to make sure buildings were safe, comfortable, and beautiful. Architects from around the world came to New York to learn and experiment. They tried new materials like steel and concrete. They tested new building methods. They designed buildings that had never been seen before. Cities in Asia, Europe, and South America all have skylines that look similar to New York's. They created a city where millions of people could live and work in a small space. They proved that architecture could be both practical and beautiful. They showed that buildings could be more than just shelter. They could be works of art that inspire and amaze. The techniques invented in New York are used to build tall buildings everywhere. New problems are still being solved. The city's skyline keeps changing as each generation of architects adds their own chapter to this amazing story. The materials first used in New York are now standard around the world. How do you bring natural light into offices that are far from windows? How do you move thousands of people in and out of a building every day? It is the story of how people learned to build up instead of out. They created new building shapes that allowed air and light to reach every floor. They designed elevators that could carry many people quickly and safely. The buildings got taller, stronger, and more beautiful. They also became more efficient. Modern skyscrapers use less energy than old ones. They are safer in earthquakes and fires. They are more comfortable for the people who work in them. They built underground systems to bring water, electricity, and heat to every building. They even figured out how to clean the outside of buildings that were hundreds of feet tall. It is the story of how a small island became home to millions of people. Most importantly, it is the story of how architecture can change the way people live. The skyscrapers seem to go on forever, each one trying to reach higher than the next. This was her first time visiting New York, and she could not understand how people had built such tall structures. How did they stay up? How did people get to the top floors? Why did they build them so high in the first place? Sarah was not alone in her wonder. New York City sits on a group of islands. The solution was simple but revolutionary. Instead of building out, New York would build up. Land was expensive and limited. People needed to make the most of every square foot. They began to experiment with new ways of building. They invented new materials and new machines. They found new ways to bring light and air into tall buildings. They learned how to move people up and down quickly and safely. This decision changed everything. It changed how people lived, how they worked, and how they saw their city. It also changed architecture forever. For New York, most buildings were only a few stories tall. People built them this way because it was hard to walk up many stairs. There were no elevators. There was no steel strong enough to hold up very tall buildings. Most importantly, there was no need for such tall buildings. Land was cheap and plentiful in most places. New York was different. The results were amazing. But New York's architecture is about more than just height. New York's architects found answers to all these questions. The city became a giant laboratory for new ideas. Each generation of architects built on the work of those who came before them. Today, New York's influence on architecture reaches every corner of the world. But New York's architectural story is not just about buildings, it is about people. Every building in the city was designed for human beings. The story of New York's architecture is also the story of America itself. The city grew as America grew, became more diverse as America became more diverse. When people visit New York today, they often focus on the famous buildings. New York's architects did not just build tall buildings, they built a new way of living. The story of New York's architecture continues today. New buildings are still being built, new technologies are still being tested. This is why New York's architecture matters so much. It is not just about the past, it is about the future. The old man at the museum pointed to a faded map on the wall. This is what Manhattan looked like in 1624, he told the group of visitors. See how different it was back then? Maria leaned forward to get a better look. The map showed an island covered with trees and hills. There were no tall buildings, no straight streets, and no bridges. Instead, she saw a few small houses scattered along the water's edge in winding paths that followed the natural shape of the land. The Dutch were the first Europeans to build permanent homes here, the guide continued. They called this place New Amsterdam. In 1624, they arrived on Manhattan Island, looking for a place to trade with Native Americans. They were not planning to build a great city, they just wanted a safe place to do business and store their goods. It was nothing like the New York we know today. The story of New York's architecture begins with these Dutch settlers. In Holland, towns grew naturally around harbors and rivers. Streets followed the shape of the land. Houses were built wherever it was convenient. This is exactly what happened in New Amsterdam. The streets curved and twisted. Some were wide and some were narrow. There was no master plan. They used wood and brick. They made steep roofs that could handle heavy snow. The New English streets were plain and practical, but the grid system had one huge advantage. It made it easy to divide land into lots that could be bought and sold. This made it much easier for the city to grow. They built their houses close together for protection and warmth. Most importantly, they built them low to the ground. The new country was growing fast, and New York was growing with it. People came from all over America and from other countries. They needed places to live and work. The demand for buildings grew quickly. They especially admired the buildings of ancient Greece and Rome. These classical buildings had columns, triangular roofs, and balanced proportions. American architects thought these styles represented democracy and freedom. They began to build banks, government buildings, and churches that looked like ancient temples. The tallest buildings in New Amsterdam were only 2 or 3 stories high. The Dutch built their first houses the same way they built houses back home in Holland. It was built in 1789 on Wall Street. This is where George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States. Architects began to use iron beams to support floors and roofs. Ships from all over the world brought goods to the city. These goods had to be stored in warehouses. The people who bought and sold these goods needed offices. They also had to learn how to build different types of buildings for different purposes. A warehouse needed different features than an office building. A church needed different features than a house. The workers who loaded and unloaded the ships needed places to live. This allowed them to build bigger rooms with fewer columns. It also made buildings stronger and safer. The building had tall columns and a classical design. As the city grew, these buildings were built closer and closer together. The Erie Canal opened in 1825, connecting New York to the Great Lakes. This made New York the gateway to the American West. More goods flowed through the city. More people came to live and work there. Most buildings were still only 3 or 4 stories tall. But the city was growing fast, and architects were beginning to experiment with new ideas. By 1800, many neighborhoods were crowded with buildings that shared walls with their neighbors. The city was spreading north from the original Dutch settlement at the southern tip of Manhattan. New neighborhoods were being built every year. Each neighborhood had its own character, but all of them followed the grid system laid out by the English. It showed that America could build buildings that were just as grand as those in Europe. It also changed the way buildings looked from the outside. Large windows became an important part of architectural design. They brought their own building traditions with them. Irish stoneworkers built churches and public buildings. German craftsmen built houses and shops. These immigrants added new skills and new ideas to New York's architecture. The city had the people, the money, and the ambition to build something completely new. All it needed was the technology to build higher and stronger than ever before. That technology was about to arrive, and it would change everything. The Dutch also brought their ideas about how to organize a town. In 1664, the English took control of New Amsterdam and renamed it New York. The English had very different ideas about how to build a city. They believed in order and planning. They wanted straight streets and organized neighborhoods. But the Dutch period did not last long. English made one decision that would change New York forever. They decided to create a grid system for the northern part of Manhattan. This meant that all the streets would run in straight lines. Some streets would run north to south. Others would run east to west. This would create blocks that were all the same size and shape. The grid system seemed boring to many people. The old Dutch streets had character and charm. After the American Revolution in 1776, New York became an American city. American architects in the early 1800s looked to Europe for inspiration. One of the most important buildings from this period was Federal Hall. But most people in New York did not live in grand buildings. They lived in simple wooden houses or small brick buildings. The early 1800s brought new materials and new building methods to New York. Iron became cheaper and easier to work with. Glass also became more available. Windows could be made larger and clearer. This brought more light into buildings. The most important change in this period was the growth of commerce. New York was becoming America's most important port. All of this created a huge demand for buildings. Architects had to learn how to build quickly and cheaply. By 1820, New York had more than 100,000 people. The 1830s and 1840s brought even more changes. Immigration also changed the city. People came from Ireland, Germany, and other European countries. By 1850, New York had become America's largest city. It had more than 500,000 people. The skyline was still low by today's standards. The stage was set for the next chapter in New York's architectural story. The construction worker wiped sweat from his forehead as he looked up at the half-finished building. "You know," he said to his partner, "my grandfather used to tell stories about the men who first figured out how to build tall buildings in this city. He said they were like magicians, making impossible things happen." His partner nodded as he adjusted his hard hat. Those old architects had to be brave. Nobody had ever built anything like what they were trying to do. They had to learn as they went along. These were the architects who took the city from a collection of low buildings to the vertical wonder it became. They were not just designers. They were inventors, problem solvers, and dreamers who refused to accept that things could not be done. These two workers were talking about some of the most important people in New York's history. Stuyvesant was the Dutch governor of New Amsterdam in the 1640s and 1650s. He understood that a city needed more than just random buildings scattered around. It needed planning and organization. He made rules about how houses should be built and where they should be placed. He required that buildings be made of brick or stone instead of wood to prevent fires. This building was where George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States in 1789. L'Enfant wanted to create a building that would show the world that America was a serious and important nation. He understood that architecture was not just about individual buildings. It was about creating a place where people could live and work together safely and efficiently. He also planned the first public spaces in the city. He used tall columns and classical proportions, but he also added American touches. The building was both elegant and practical. It showed that American architects could create buildings that were just as beautiful as those in Europe. L'Enfant had to train local workers and import materials from far away. His success proved that great architecture was possible in America. These ideas seem simple now, but they were revolutionary at the time. The first of these pioneers was Peter Stuyvesant, though he was not an architect in the traditional sense. These buildings looked like ancient Greek temples, with tall columns and triangular roofs. Americans loved this style because it reminded them of ancient democracy. He was an innovator who found new ways to adapt old ideas. He figured out how to use Greek columns to support much larger buildings than the ancient Greeks had ever built. Hunt was the first American to study at the famous École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. When he returned to New York, he brought with him the latest European ideas about architecture. Hunt's buildings were covered with elaborate decorations. They had carved stone, painted ceilings, and detailed metalwork. He also learned how to use new materials like iron and steel within traditional designs. Davis built churches, banks, and government buildings all over New York. When the statue arrived from France, it needed a pedestal to stand on. Hunt designed a base that was both strong enough to support the statue and beautiful enough to match its importance. Hunt believed that architects should be artists, not just builders. He encouraged them to study art, history, and culture. White's buildings were dramatic and theatrical. They were designed to make people stop and stare. He wanted them to understand that buildings could express ideas and emotions. Stuyvesant created the first building codes in what would become New York. His buildings were larger and more decorative than anything that had been built before. This building was a huge arena that could hold thousands of people. But it was also a work of art, with a beautiful tower that became one of New York's most recognizable landmarks. Before them, buildings were designed by carpenters, masons, and engineers. These men established architecture as an art form that required special training and skills. They used new materials and new construction methods, but they also honored the great architectural traditions of the past. Hunt's mansions showed that American architects could create buildings that were just as grand as those built for European royalty. Architects from all over America came to New York to learn from these masters. The ideas that started in New York spread across the country and around the world. One of the most important was Alexander Jackson Davis. Davis was born in New York and grew up watching the city change. He saw how the old Dutch and English buildings were being replaced by new American styles. They showed that buildings could serve their users while also inspiring and uplifting them. This idea would become the foundation for all the great architecture that followed in New York. When Stuyvesant walked through his city, he could see how each building fit into the larger picture. His churches had good acoustics so everyone could hear the sermons. His banks had strong vaults, but also comfortable spaces for customers. His government buildings were impressive, but also practical for the people who worked in them. After the English took over, a new type of architect came to New York. Pierre L'Enfant was a French engineer who had fought in the American Revolution. He was famous for designing the city of Washington, D.C. But he also did important work in New York. L'Enfant's most important project in New York was Federal Hall. L'Enfant studied the great buildings of Europe and adapted their ideas for America. L'Enfant faced many challenges while building Federal Hall. There were no established building suppliers in New York. There were no skilled stone carvers or metalworkers. As New York grew in the early 1800s, a new generation of architects emerged. Davis became famous for his Greek Revival buildings. But Davis was more than just a copycat of ancient styles. Davis also understood something that many architects missed. He knew that buildings needed to work for the people who used them. The most influential architect of the mid-1800s was Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt believed that buildings should be works of art. He did not just want them to be functional. He wanted them to be beautiful and inspiring. Hunt's most famous building in New York was the base of the Statue of Liberty. Hunt also built many mansions for wealthy New Yorkers. These houses were like palaces, with dozens of rooms and every luxury imaginable. But Hunt's greatest contribution was not any single building.
Yes.
It was the way he taught other architects to think about their work. Stanford White was Hunt's most famous student. White took his teacher's ideas and made them even bolder. White understood that New York was becoming a modern city. It needed buildings that reflected its energy and ambition. White's most famous building was the original Madison Square Garden. These pioneers did more than just design buildings. They created a new profession. They also established New York as a center of architectural innovation. Most importantly, these pioneers proved that architecture could be both practical and beautiful. The young architecture student sat in the library staring at a book filled with drawings of New York buildings. She was trying to understand why some buildings worked better than others. Why did some buildings make people feel happy and comfortable while others felt cold and unfriendly? Her professor walked over and sat down beside her. "You were looking at the right question," he he said. The best architects in New York learned 5 important principles. Once you understand these principles, you can understand why New York looks the way it does. The professor opened the book to a page showing the city skyline. The first principle is verticality. Each one seemed to reach toward the sky in its own way. New York had to build up because it could not build out. But going vertical was not just about saving space. It became an art form. The student looked at the tall buildings in the picture. Some were thin and graceful, others were thick and powerful. When you build a tall building, you have to think about wind. Almost every successful tall building in New York followed this pattern. It worked because it made very large buildings feel familiar and comfortable to people who were used to smaller buildings. It was about creating neighborhoods where people could live, work, and play without having to travel far. The best New York architects learned how to design buildings that could serve multiple purposes. You have to think about how the building will sway. You have to think about how people will get to the top floors. They designed buildings with courtyards and gardens that gave people outdoor space even in the middle of the city. They found ways to bring light and air into buildings that were surrounded by other buildings. These buildings were usually 4 or 5 stories tall and about 20 feet wide. They were built right next to each other, with no space between them. From the outside, they looked like one long building. But inside, each one was a separate home for one family. New York buildings had to be able to change as the city changed. A building that worked perfectly in 1850 might not work at all in 1900. Most importantly, you have to think about how to make a tall building feel human. The ground floor had a high ceiling and large windows for entertaining guests. The second floor had the main living rooms. The third and fourth floors had bedrooms. The best New York architects used materials and construction methods that made this possible. Buildings that were originally factories became warehouses. Warehouses became artist studios. Studios became expensive apartments. The buildings survived because they could change with the times. The basement had the kitchen and storage. Each floor was designed for different activities. Building tall is harder than building wide, the professor explained. An architect could take the columns from a Greek temple, the arches from a Roman building, and the decorations from a French palace, and combine them all in one building. The result was something completely new, but also familiar. When technology changed, new systems for heating, lighting, and plumbing could be added. When fashions changed, the outside of the building could be updated with new decorations. The architect used Gothic arches from medieval Europe, but he built them with modern materials and techniques. The church looked ancient and timeless, but it was also perfectly suited for 19th century New York, a building that combined styles from different places. Made everyone feel welcome. It also allowed architects to solve practical problems by using the best solution from any tradition. This meant that every square foot had to be used wisely. They had to think about how people would move through the spaces. They had to consider how much light people needed for different activities. Architects had to visit similar buildings and watch how people used them. They had to experiment with different layouts and materials. They had to test their ideas and learn from their mistakes. Buildings that followed these principles felt right in the city. They served their users well, and they contributed to the larger life of the neighborhood. Their buildings worked so well that people did not even notice the design. The rooms were the right size, the windows were in the right places, the doors opened in the right directions. Everything seemed natural and obvious. They are about creating a city that works for people. They had to plan for the furniture and equipment that people would need. In a top, just like people have feet, a body, and a head. The base was usually made of heavy stone that looked strong and solid. The middle was where most people worked or lived. The top was often decorated with special features that made the buildings stand out against the sky. New York buildings had to work well for the people who used them. Beauty was important, but it could never come at the expense of usefulness. The iron frame held up the building, so the walls did not have to be thick and heavy. Now this meant that the inside of the building could be arranged in many different ways. The early architects in New York discovered that tall buildings needed to have a base. A middle. This 3-part design became known as the classical skyscraper formula. The professor turned to another page. The second principle is density. New York had to fit millions of people into a small space. Density was about more than just putting many buildings close together. They created buildings with shops on the ground floor, offices on the middle floors, and apartments on the top floors. The most famous example of good density was the brownstone row house. Brownstones worked because they were designed for the way people actually lived. The third principle is adaptability, the professor continued. Adaptability meant designing buildings that could be modified, expanded, or even completely changed inside without tearing them down. Cast iron was one of the most important adaptable materials. Cast iron buildings had thin walls and large windows. When businesses changed, the inside of a cast iron building could be completely redesigned. The Soho neighborhood in Manhattan is full of cast iron buildings that have been adapted many times. The fourth principle is eclecticism, the professor said. New York architects learned to borrow the best ideas from everywhere, combine them in new ways. Eclecticism meant that New York buildings did not have to follow one single style. This approach worked in New York because the city was full of people from many different countries and cultures. Trinity Church in Manhattan is a good example of eclecticism. The fifth and most important principle is functionality, the professor concluded. Functionality meant that architects had to understand how people would actually use their buildings. The best New York architects made functionality look effortless. But achieving this kind of functionality required careful study and planning. These 5 principles worked together to create the unique character of New York architecture. The student closed the book and looked up at her professor. "I think I understand now," she said. "These principles are not just about buildings." The professor smiled. Exactly. The best New York architects understood that they were not just designing buildings, they were designing a way of life. The young architecture student sat in the library staring at a book filled with drawings of New York buildings. She was trying to understand why some buildings worked better than others. Why did some buildings make people feel happy and comfortable while others felt cold and unfriendly? Her professor walked over and sat down beside her. "You were looking at the right question," he said. The best architects in New York learned 5 important principles. Once you understand these principles, you can understand why New York looks the way it does. The professor opened the book to a page showing the city skyline. The first principle is verticality. Each one seemed to reach toward the sky in its own way. New York had to build up because it could not build out. But going vertical was not just about saving space. It became an art form. The student looked at the tall buildings in the picture. Some were thin and graceful, others were thick and powerful. When you build a tall building, you have to think about wind. Almost every successful tall building in New York followed this pattern. It worked because it made very large buildings feel familiar and comfortable to people who were used to smaller buildings. It was about creating neighborhoods where people could live, work, and play without having to travel far. The best New York architects learned how to design buildings that could serve multiple purposes. You have to think about how the building will sway. You have to think about how people will get to the top floors. They designed buildings with courtyards and gardens that gave people outdoor space even in the middle of the city. They found ways to bring light and air into buildings that were surrounded by other buildings. These buildings were usually 4 or 5 stories tall and about 20 feet wide. They were built right next to each other, with no space between them. From the outside, they looked like one long building. But inside, each one was a separate home for one family. New York buildings had to be able to change as the city changed. A building that worked perfectly in 1850 might not work at all in 1900. Most importantly, you have to think about how to make a tall building feel human. The ground floor had a high ceiling and large windows for entertaining guests. The second floor had the main living rooms. The third and fourth floors had bedrooms. The best New York architects used materials and construction methods that made this possible. Buildings that were originally factories became warehouses. Warehouses became artist studios. Studios became expensive apartments. The buildings survived because they could change with the times. The basement had the kitchen and storage. Each floor was designed for different activities. Building tall is harder than building wide, the professor explained. An architect could take the columns from a Greek temple, the arches from a Roman building, and the decorations from a French palace, and combine them all in one building. The result was something completely new, but also familiar. When technology changed, new systems for heating, lighting, and plumbing could be added. When fashions changed, the outside of the building could be updated with new decorations. The architect used Gothic arches from medieval Europe, but he built them with modern materials and techniques. The church looked ancient and timeless, but it was also perfectly suited for 19th century New York. a building that combined styles from different places. Made everyone feel welcome. It also allowed architects to solve practical problems by using the best solution from any tradition. This meant that every square foot had to be used wisely. They had to think about how people would move through the spaces. They had to consider how much light people needed for different activities. Architects had to visit similar buildings and watch how people used them. They had to experiment with different layouts and materials, had to test their ideas and learn from their mistakes. Buildings that followed these principles felt right in the city. They served their users well, and they contributed to the larger life of the neighborhood. Their buildings worked so well that people did not even notice the design. The rooms were the right size, the windows were in the right places, the doors opened in the right directions. Everything seemed natural and obvious. They are about creating a city that works for people. They had to plan for the furniture and equipment that people would need. In a top, just like people have feet, a body, and a head. The base was usually made of heavy stone that looked strong and solid. The middle was where most people worked or lived. The top was often decorated with special features that made the buildings stand out against the sky. New York buildings had to work well for the people who used them. Beauty was important, but it could never come at the expense of usefulness. The iron frame held up the building, so the walls did not have to be thick and heavy. Now this meant that the inside of the building could be arranged in many different ways. The early architects in New York discovered that tall buildings needed to have a base. A middle, this three-part design became known as the classical skyscraper formula. The professor turned to another page. The second principle is density. New York had to fit millions of people into a small space. Density was about more than just putting many buildings close together. They created buildings with shops on the ground floor, offices on the middle floors, and apartments on the top floors. The most famous example of good density was the brownstone row house. Brownstones worked because they were designed for the way people actually lived. The third principle is adaptability, the professor continued. Adaptability meant designing buildings that could be modified, expanded, or even completely changed inside without tearing them down. Cast iron was one of the most important adaptable materials. Cast iron buildings had thin walls and large windows. When businesses changed, the inside of a cast iron building could be completely redesigned. The Soho neighborhood in Manhattan is full of cast iron buildings that have been adapted many times. The fourth principle is eclecticism, the professor said. New York architects learned to borrow the best ideas from everywhere, combine them in new ways. Eclecticism meant that New York buildings did not have to follow one single style. This approach worked in New York because the city was full of people from many different countries and cultures. Trinity Church in Manhattan is a good example of eclecticism. The fifth and most important principle is functionality, the professor concluded. Functionality meant that architects had to understand how people would actually use their buildings. The best New York architects made functionality look effortless. But achieving this kind of functionality required careful study and planning. These 5 principles worked together to create the unique character of New York architecture. The student closed the book and looked up at her professor. "I think I understand now," she said. "These principles are not just about buildings." The professor smiled. "Exactly." The best New York architects understood that they were not just designing buildings, they were designing a way of life. The taxi driver pulled over to the curb and turned off his engine. He pointed up through the windshield at the gleaming tower rising above them. "You see that building, lady? That is the Chrysler Building." The building seemed to go on forever, getting narrower and more decorated as it rose toward the clouds. The top was covered in shiny metal that caught the sunlight like a jewel. When they finished it in 1930, it was the tallest building in the whole world. The young reporter stepped out of the taxi and craned her neck to look up. She was writing a story about the building boom that was transforming New York in the 1920s. In the 1930s, everyone called it the golden age of skyscrapers. It seemed like every month, someone was building a taller, more beautiful, more exciting building than the last one. 77 stories, he replied proudly, as if he had built it himself. But you know what? It was only the tallest for 11 months. People had money to spend. They wanted to live in a world that looked like the future. They wanted buildings that were as bold and energetic as the music playing in the nightclubs and the movies showing in the theaters. Van Allen understood that the 1920s were different from any other time in history. People were driving cars, flying in airplanes, listening to radio and watching movies. The lower floors were covered with black and white marble arranged in bold patterns. The upper floors were decorated with metal sculptures that looked like automobile parts. The very top of the building was covered with shiny steel that changed color as the sun moved across the sky. Buildings needed to capture this sense of speed and excitement. Wealthy businessmen competed to see who could build the most impressive skyscraper. They hired the best architects and spent enormous amounts of money on decorations and advanced technology. Rockefeller Center included offices, theaters, restaurants, and shops, all designed in the same bold style. The centerpiece was a 70-story tower with a famous ice skating rink at its base. There were lightning bolts, sunbursts, and zigzag patterns. They used materials like aluminum, stainless steel, and colored glass that sparkled and gleamed. This building was designed by the architectural firm of Shreve, Lamb and Harmon. It had to solve an almost impossible problem. Their client wanted the tallest building in the world, but he also wanted it finished in record time. Workers had detailed instructions for every step of the process. The building rose at the incredible rate of 14 floors per month. It was the tallest building in the world and would remain so for 40 years. But it was more than just tall. It was also beautiful. With a limestone facade that glowed golden in the sunset, visitors came from every country to see these amazing skyscrapers. They took photographs and made plans to build similar buildings in their own cities, and a famous spire that could be lit up in different colors. The buildings looked like rockets ready to blast off into space. This building housed a movie theater, and the architects designed every detail to create a sense of glamour and excitement. The lobby had a ceiling painted like the night sky with tiny lights that twinkled like stars. The theater itself was designed to look like an underwater palace. Then they finished the Empire State Building, and that one was even taller. People no longer had money for elaborate decorations and expensive materials. They needed buildings that were practical and economical rather than glamorous and exciting. When people around the world thought of New York, they pictured the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building reaching toward the sky. He knew that other architects were also trying to build the world's tallest building. He kept his final plans secret so that no one could copy them. When the building was almost finished, he surprised everyone by adding a tall spire that made his building the tallest in the world. They showed that buildings could express the spirit of their time, while also serving the practical needs of their users. Most importantly, they demonstrated that Americans could create an architectural style that was uniquely their own. In the fading light of evening, its metal crown caught the last rays of the sun and seemed to glow with its own inner fire. She understood why people called this the Golden Age. These buildings were not just made of steel and stone. They were made of dreams and ambition, reaching always toward the sky. The reporter smiled. He designed lobbies that were like grand theaters, with high ceilings, dramatic lighting, and expensive materials. Art Deco buildings had the most advanced air conditioning systems, the fastest elevators, and the most efficient lighting. They were designed for the modern world of business, where speed and efficiency were just as important as beauty. They even designed the furniture and light fixtures to match the architectural style. It was about creating spaces that made people feel optimistic and energetic. The lobbies were filled with colorful murals showing scenes of progress and prosperity. The elevators were lined with polished metal and colored lights. Even the restrooms were designed to look like something from the future. This was the Jazz Age, and New York was the center of everything modern and exciting in America. The style that captured this spirit was called Art Deco. Art Deco was different from anything that had come before. Instead of copying ancient Greek temples or medieval castles, Art Deco architects created something completely new. They used geometric shapes, bold lines, and decorative patterns that looked like they came from a science fiction movie. Art Deco buildings were covered with decorations, but these decorations were not flowers or leaves like on older buildings. The man who started this revolution was William Van Allen, the architect of the Chrysler Building. Van Allen designed the Chrysler Building to look like a work of art. But the most amazing thing about the Chrysler Building was how Van Allen built it. The competition to build the tallest building became known as the Race to the Sky. John D. Rockefeller Jr. decided to build an entire complex of Art Deco skyscrapers in the heart of Manhattan. The architects of Rockefeller Center understood that Art Deco was about more than just decoration. But the greatest achievement of the Art Deco era was the Empire State Building. The architects designed the Empire State Building like a machine for construction. Every piece was planned in advance. Materials were delivered exactly when they were needed. The Empire State Building was 102 stories tall and took only 13 months to build. The success of the Empire State Building proved that American architects and builders were the best in the world. Art Deco architects also changed the way the insides of buildings looked and worked. The Paramount Building showed how Art Deco could make even ordinary activities feel special. But Art Deco was not just about making buildings look modern. It was also about using the latest technology to make buildings work better. The golden age of Art Deco came to an end with the Great Depression and World War II. But the legacy of Art Deco lived on. These buildings became symbols of New York and of America itself. The Art Deco skyscrapers also proved that architecture could be both beautiful and functional. As the reporter finished her notes and prepared to leave, she took one more look at the Chrysler Building. The office worker pressed her face against the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the street 20 stories below. Cars and people looked like toys from this height. She could see for miles in every direction through the clear glass walls that surrounded her office. When I started working here 5 years ago, I could not believe how different this building was from the old one. No thick walls, no small windows, no dark hallways. Everything is light and open. Amazing, is it not? Said her colleague, joining her at the window. The woman nodded as she looked around the office. The ceiling was a flat slab supported by thin steel columns. The walls were made entirely of glass. Even the interior walls were glass panels that could be moved to create different room layouts. Everything was clean, simple, and modern. It was part of a revolution in architecture that was changing the way buildings looked and worked. People called it the international style or modern architecture. It was completely different from the decorated Art Deco. Buildings of the 1920s and 1930s, these men believed that architecture should be honest and functional. They thought that decorating buildings with unnecessary ornaments was dishonest and wasteful. Buildings should look like what they were, machines for living and working. His furniture was made of simple materials like leather, steel, and wood. Everything was designed to work perfectly and look beautiful at the same time. He believed that the best buildings were the simplest ones. He stripped away all decorations and focused on perfect proportions and beautiful materials, completed in 1952. The architect, Gordon Bunshaft, had studied the work of Mies and other European modernists. He designed a building that looked like nothing that had ever been built before. Others hated it because it was so different from the traditional buildings around it. But everyone agreed that it represented something completely new. This was 1960, and they were working in one of New York's newest skyscrapers. The most famous was the Seagram Building. It's completed in 1958. This building was designed by Mies van der Rohe himself. It's working with the American architect Philip Johnson. The ground floor was completely open, creating a public plaza in the middle of busy Park Avenue. The office floors above were enclosed in walls of blue-green glass that reflected the sky and clouds. Companies could arrange their space however they wanted. The lobby was a temple to modern materials: marble, bronze, and glass arranged in perfect geometric patterns. The building seemed to float in the air like a piece of sculpture. Urban planners and architects believed that they could solve social problems by tearing down old neighborhoods and replacing them with modern buildings. The revolution had started in Europe in the 1920s with architects like Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Entire neighborhoods were demolished to make way for housing projects, office complexes, and cultural centers. The most famous of these projects was Lincoln Center, a complex of modern buildings designed for music, opera, and theater. The buildings were beautiful examples of modern architecture, with clean lines and elegant proportions. The complex created a cultural center that brought together the world's best performers and audiences. Thousands of people were forced to move so that the complex could be built. Many critics argued that the old neighborhood, with its mix of different types of buildings and activities, had been more interesting and livable than the new modern complex. When World War II ended in 1945, many of these European architects came to America. The Twin Towers were designed by Minoru Yamasaki to be the tallest buildings in the world. They were perfect examples of modernist principles: simple geometric forms, minimal decoration, and maximum efficiency. It was a perfect rectangle covered in bronze-colored glass and steel. It had no decorations except for the beautiful proportions of its windows and the rich materials of its facade. Cities that had been rebuilt with glass boxes and urban renewal projects often felt sterile and unwelcoming. People missed the variety and character of older neighborhoods and buildings. Sometimes people needed buildings that were warm and welcoming rather than cool and efficient. Sometimes decoration and ornament made buildings more pleasant to use. Sometimes old buildings were worth preserving rather than tearing down. It sat back from the street, creating a plaza with fountains and trees. They brought their ideas with them and found that Americans were ready for something completely new. It had proven that new materials like glass and steel could create beautiful architecture. It had demonstrated that architecture could be a tool for social progress. The war had changed everything. People wanted to forget the past and build a better future. They wanted buildings that looked forward, not backward. People needed more than efficiency and cleanliness. They needed variety, character, and connection to the past, as well as the future. They used advanced engineering techniques that allowed the exterior walls to support the building's weight. This created vast open floors with no interior columns. The building was undeniably impressive, with its soaring spaces and perfect climate control. But sometimes, she missed the quirky charm of the old building where she used to work. With its thick walls, small windows, and unexpected corners, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe became the most influential architect in this new movement. Mies had a famous saying, "Less is more." The buildings were so large that they seemed to dwarf the people who worked in them. The plaza at their base was windy and uncomfortable. Critics said that the buildings showed everything that was wrong with modernist architecture. Mies designed buildings that were like elegant machines. His walls were made of glass and steel. His floors were open spaces with no interior walls. But as the 1970s came to an end, architects were beginning to wonder what would come next. They had learned to build glass boxes. Now, they needed to learn how to make those boxes feel like home. The first major example of this new style in New York was Lever House. Lever House was a glass box sitting on thin steel pillars. People had never seen anything like Lever House. Some loved it because it looked so clean and modern. The success of Lever House led to many more glass box buildings in New York. The Seagram building was everything that Mies believed a modern building should be. Inside, the Seagram building was just as revolutionary. The office floors were completely open, with no permanent walls. But the modernist revolution was about more than just office buildings. It was about changing the entire city. This idea led to massive urban renewal. Projects in the 1950s and 1960s, Lincoln Center showed both the best and worst of modernist urban planning. But Lincoln Center also required the destruction of an entire neighborhood. The most ambitious modernist project in New York was the World Trade Center, completed in 1973. The Twin Towers were 110 stories tall and contained more office space than some entire cities. But many people found the Twin Towers cold and impersonal. By the 1970s, people were beginning to question the modernist revolution. Architects began to realize that less is more was not always true. The modernist revolution had achieved many important things. It had shown that buildings could be more efficient and comfortable than ever before. But the revolution had also shown the dangers of trying to solve complex human problems with simple architectural solutions. Buildings alone could not create perfect communities. As the woman in the glass office building finished her work for the day, she reflected on her surroundings. The modernist revolution had changed New York forever. The young architect from Tokyo stood in the middle of Times Square, slowly turning in a circle as she took photographs of the towering buildings around her. She had traveled halfway around the world to see these skyscrapers with her own eyes. Back home in Japan, her firm was designing a new business district that would look very much like this. "Excuse me," she said to an elderly man sitting on a nearby bench. "I am studying architecture. Can you tell me about these buildings?" The old man smiled and pointed up at the nearest skyscraper. "I have lived in New York for 70 years, he said. I've watched this city teach the whole world how to build tall buildings. Cities in Asia, Europe, South America, and Australia all had skylines that looked remarkably similar to Manhattan. The skyscraper had become the symbol of modern civilization everywhere. Now everywhere you go, you see buildings that look like they came from New York." The old man was right. In 1980, the architectural ideas that had been invented in New York had spread to every continent. Buildings like Lever House and the Seagram Building became models that were copied in cities everywhere. The glass box skyscraper became the standard design for office buildings from São Paulo to Singapore. Students from around the world came to study at American architecture schools and then took what they learned back to their home countries. New York architects and engineers had developed new techniques for foundation work, steel frame construction, and mechanical systems. They studied Japanese architecture and incorporated ideas about simplicity and natural materials. They looked at European cities and learned about urban planning and public spaces. An office building in Hong Kong might use construction techniques developed in New York, design principles from Germany, and materials from Japan. Architecture became a global language that was understood everywhere. American construction companies began working on projects around the world. American elevator companies, steel manufacturers, and glass producers found new markets in every country. The expertise developed in building New York skyscrapers became one of America's most valuable exports. They examined buildings from around the world and adapted the best ideas for use in New York. These techniques were described in technical journals and taught in engineering schools around the world. This global influence had started early in New York's architectural history. Cities facing rapid population growth looked to New York for solutions to housing and workspace shortages. When the first skyscrapers were built in the 1890s, newspapers and magazines around the world published photographs and drawings of these amazing new buildings. Architects in other countries studied these images and began to experiment with similar designs. When New Yorkers successfully fought to save Grand Central Terminal and other historic buildings from demolition, they inspired similar preservation efforts in cities everywhere. The techniques developed for preserving New York's cast iron buildings in Soho were used to save similar buildings in cities from Manchester to Melbourne. The idea that old buildings could be valuable and worth saving, even if they were not monuments, was revolutionary. Photographs of this cathedral of commerce appeared in architectural journals in London, Paris, Berlin, and Moscow. The idea that different areas of a city should be designated for different uses: residential, commercial, industrial, became standard practice in urban planning worldwide. The energy crisis made people realize that buildings consumed enormous amounts of energy. New York architects began experimenting with energy-efficient designs and green building techniques that were later adopted worldwide. Within a few years, similar Gothic skyscrapers were being built in cities across Europe. New York had shown that it was possible to house millions of people in a relatively small area, while still maintaining a high quality of life. Cities around the world studied New York's solutions to problems like transportation, utilities, and public services. Urban planners studied how New York balanced the needs of residents, workers, and visitors. The city became a center for architectural education, with schools that attracted students from around the world. Architectural firms in New York began opening offices in other countries, spreading their expertise and design philosophy globally. Architects like Frank Lloyd Wright, Philip Johnson, and later Impey became international celebrities, whose buildings were sought after by cities competing for prestige and recognition. They learned how public spaces, transportation systems, and building regulations could work together to create livable cities. The idea that a commercial building could be both tall and beautiful had captured the imagination of architects everywhere. Architects like Robert Venturi and Philip Johnson began designing buildings that combined modern techniques with historical references and decorative elements. The city proved that buildings are not just shelter, but expressions of human creativity and ambition. They can inspire people, represent values, and shape the way communities develop and interact. This movement quickly spread to other cities and countries. The basic principles developed in Manhattan: steel frame construction, curtain wall facades, mixed-use, development, zoning regulations, have become the foundation of modern urban design everywhere. The image of New York as a place where anything was possible, where people from different backgrounds could live and work together, inspired urban planners and politicians around the world. She was studying a way of thinking about cities that had transformed the world. The ideas born in New York had traveled across oceans and continents, helping to build the modern world one skyscraper at a time. The Woolworth Building, completed in 1913, was particularly influential. But it was not just the buildings themselves that influenced the world. It was also the methods used to build them. The international style of the 1950s and 1960s had an even greater global impact. European architects who had come to New York to escape the war helped spread these ideas when they returned home or moved to other countries. The influence was not just one way. New York architects also learned from other countries. This exchange of ideas made architecture truly international for the first time in history. The economic impact of New York's architectural influence was enormous. But perhaps the most important influence was on urban planning. The concept of zoning, which had been developed in New York in the early 1900s, was adopted by cities everywhere. New York's mixed-use buildings, which combined offices, shops, and apartments in the same structure, became models for dense urban development. The preservation movement that began in New York in the 1960s also influenced cities around the world. Historic districts, landmark protection laws, and adaptive reuse projects became common in cities around the world. Environmental concerns that emerged in the 1970s also spread from New York to other cities. The postmodern movement that began to challenge modernist orthodoxy in the 1970s also started in New York, but New York's influence went beyond technical and aesthetic innovations. It also influenced the way people thought about cities and urban life.
Wow.
The idea that a city could be both efficient and exciting, both practical and beautiful, became a goal for cities everywhere. New York also influenced the profession of architecture itself. The concept of the starchitect, the celebrity architect whose name alone could sell a project, also originated in New York. Today, when someone sees a modern skyline anywhere in the world, they are seeing the influence of New York architecture. But New York's greatest legacy may be the idea that architecture matters. As the young architect from Tokyo finished taking her photographs, she realized that she was not just documenting buildings. The construction worker secured his safety harness and stepped out onto the narrow platform 1,000 feet above the street. From this height, the cars below looked like moving dots, and the people were invisible. He was working on the top floors of one of New York's newest supertall towers, a gleaming spire that would soon rise even higher than the Empire State Building. "Hard to believe we are building this tall," he said to his partner through the radio in his helmet. "My grandfather worked on the Empire State Building back in 1930. He would be amazed to see what we can do now. The technology is incredible. This building has systems that the old-timers could never have imagined. It can almost think for itself." His partner nodded as he guided a steel beam into place with a computer-controlled crane. But this boom was different from all the others. Architects were not just trying to build taller or more spectacular buildings. They were trying to solve problems that had never existed before: climate change, energy conservation, and the need to house an aging population in smaller spaces. It had solar panels built into its glass facade. It collected rainwater for use in its cooling systems. The architect, Philip Johnson, topped the building with a broken pediment that looked like the top of an old grandfather clock. Many people loved this playful reference to historical architecture. Others thought it was ridiculous to put such decoration on a modern office building. Not everyone wanted to live and work in glass boxes. Some people preferred buildings that felt warm and welcoming, rather than cool and efficient. Its elevators used regenerative braking that actually generated electricity as they slowed down. The South Street Seaport was restored to look like a 19th century port. The High Line, an abandoned elevated railway, was transformed into a public park. Even industrial buildings in neighborhoods like Soho and Tribeca were converted into expensive apartments and galleries. The building was designed to use less energy than buildings half its size built just 20 years earlier. They wanted to bring back decoration, color, and historical references. This movement was called postmodernism, and it produced some of the most controversial buildings in New York's history. Modern buildings could be inserted into historic neighborhoods without destroying their character. Historic buildings could be updated with modern technology while keeping their original appearance. They were working on one of the most advanced buildings ever constructed in New York. These architects were not interested in following any single style or philosophy. They could calculate how unusual forms would behave in wind and earthquakes. Water flowed down into the footprints of the original towers, disappearing into pools that seemed infinitely deep. The names of everyone who died were carved into bronze panels around the edges. It was both high-tech and deeply human. They could design every piece of a complex building so that it would fit together perfectly. Instead, they wanted to create buildings that were unique and expressive. Architects used better insulation, more efficient windows, and advanced heating and cooling systems. They designed buildings that could generate their own electricity using solar panels and wind turbines. They found ways to recycle water and reduce waste. Buildings consume enormous amounts of energy for heating, cooling, and lighting. They also produce huge amounts of carbon dioxide that contribute to global warming. Architects had to learn how to design buildings that used much less energy and produced less pollution. Daniel Libeskind created angular, crystalline structures that seemed to defy gravity. Zaha Hadid designed buildings with curved walls and organic shapes that looked like they had grown rather than been built. People called them starchitects because they became famous like movie stars. These tiny living spaces, some as small as 200 square feet, used clever design to include everything a person needed: a bed, kitchen, bathroom, and storage. They proved that good design could make even very small spaces comfortable and livable. Offices needed to be redesigned so that people could work safely while staying apart from each other. Restaurants needed outdoor seating areas. Buildings had to be more flexible so they could adapt to changing health requirements. Elevators could be called using smartphone apps. Security systems could recognize residents' faces and automatically unlock doors. As New York became more expensive, many people could not afford to live in the city where they worked. Architects had to find ways to build housing that was both high quality and affordable. This was 2020, and New York was experiencing another building boom. This observation deck, an outdoor sculpture, was built as part of a massive development project that included offices, apartments, shops, and parks. The skyline was a mixture of old and new, with Art Deco spires standing next to glass towers and experimental shapes that defied easy description. The most successful new buildings were those that made life better for their users, while also protecting the environment. These buildings had small private rooms but large shared spaces for cooking, eating, and socializing. Residents could have privacy when they wanted it, but also be part of a community. Like the early Dutch settlers, contemporary architects were learning to work with nature rather than against it. Like the pioneers of steel construction, they were using new technology to solve old problems. Like the Art Deco designers, they were creating buildings that expressed the spirit of their time. It showed how contemporary architects could create spaces that were both spectacular and sustainable. Together, they showed that architecture was not just about the past, but about the future. New York continued to be a laboratory for new ideas, a place where architects could experiment with solutions to the problems facing cities everywhere. The main tower, One World Trade Center, was designed to be both beautiful and secure. It had a crystalline form that caught light in interesting ways, but it also had thick concrete walls at its base to protect against attacks. The transformation had begun in the 1980s, when architects started to rebel against the strict rules of modernism. The AT&T building, completed in 1984, was one of the first major postmodern skyscrapers in New York. But postmodernism was more than just adding decorations to buildings. It was about recognizing that different people had different needs and preferences. This led to a new interest in preserving and restoring old buildings rather than tearing them down. The preservation movement showed that old and new could work together. By the 1990s, a new generation of architects was emerging. Frank Gehry designed buildings that looked like they were made of flowing metal. These architects used computer technology to design and build shapes that would have been impossible to construct using traditional methods. The New World Trade Center, built to replace the towers destroyed in 2001, showed how contemporary architects were balancing many different concerns. The memorial at the site used the latest technology to create a powerful emotional experience. Climate change became the biggest challenge facing architects in the 21st century. Green building techniques became standard practice. The Edge at Hudson Yards became one of the most innovative public spaces in the city. But the biggest challenge was affordable housing. Micro-apartments became one solution. Co-living buildings offered another approach. The coronavirus pandemic of 2020 created new challenges for architects. Buildings needed better air filtration systems. Technology continued to transform how buildings worked. Smart buildings could monitor their own energy use and automatically adjust their systems for maximum efficiency. But the most important lesson of contemporary New York architecture was that buildings needed to serve people, not the other way around. As the construction worker finished his shift and prepared to descend from the heights of the new tower, He looked out over the city that stretched to the horizon. Each building told part of the story of human creativity and determination. The city's architecture had come full circle in many ways. The future skyline of New York would continue to evolve, but its mission would remain the same: to show the world what was possible when human imagination met human need. Reaching always toward the sky,